Good evening. This is Pastor Jeremy. I am checking in for, well, you don't know this. This is actually the second time I've tried to record this particular devotion. I got about 2 or 3 minutes in, and the lovely train went off behind me, and I wasn't sure if you'd be able to hear me or if it would be distracting. So we're going to try this again, even though for you had no idea. Just let you in a little behind the scenes action of what is going on. Tonight, I want to do our look at one of the scriptures from our daily readings that are being passed out as part of this Sacred Stories journey that Rebecca's been posting online and in the bulletin each week. And I'm cheating a little bit tonight because I want to do Thursday's reading. I was looking through them, and for a lot of different reasons, this is one I chose to land on. So if you are already caught up and I'm getting ahead of where you plan to be tomorrow, I apologize. If you're watching this late and it didn't really impact you, then it is what it is, I guess. So I'm going to do that. So we're going to be in Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. But we're going to talk about the importance of why we continue to tell our story and why we want to continue to be active in understanding how our community changes around us and what that means for how we treat folks. So before we get there, I want to give a little backstory on this particular passage. This past Sunday, we were talking about Joseph while he was in prison. But during the message, I talked about all the things that Joseph was able to do in spite of the problems he faced. And we found that Joseph was so faithful in what he was called to do that he continued to gain prominence to where he was just helping even rule over Egypt because he had done so well. And so towards the end of Genesis, in the last chapter, couple of chapters, we see a time of relative peace. Jacob passes away, and there's some questions with the brothers about, like, okay, Joseph, you weren't going to just kill us once Dad was gone because of what we did to you, right? And he said, no, that's not my thing. He says, I'm not God. It's not my role. And aside from that, we see that it was a time of relative calm for the Israelites and for Joseph. And so they probably thought, man, we've been through so much. And here we are, we've arrived and things are going well. But then that leads us into today's passage, Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. And it says this. It says, Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put the slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. And all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. There had been this relative time of peace for the Israelites, and we see that not necessarily through animosity, although there was definitely some things that happened eventually. We see that this new leader comes into power, and this new king doesn't give a rip about Joseph. You know, Joseph had done a lot to earn credibility, and he had earned the respect, and so he had got his position of power through that. And as a result of that, we see the Israelites are treated pretty well. But now that Joseph is gone and this new leader comes in, he's like, I don't care about these people. I don't care about Joseph. And he starts to see, in fact, that they are a threat. Because what do we do with people we don't know? We accuse them, right? We shouldn't, but that's what happens. There's this fear of saying, well, I'm in charge now, and I don't want these people to revolt against us. And so what we're going to do now is we're just going to oppress them. We're going to make them work hard. We're going to make them, they're slaves, so we're going to work them, and we're going to make their lives miserable. But we read that the more that this happened, the more that the Israelites thrived, or at least they continued to multiply. And so it kind of had the opposite effect of what he was hoping for this king. But nevertheless, as I was thinking about this story, I was thinking a lot about just this first verse, verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. We know our stories pretty well. If I asked you about the story of the church The variations might change a little bit, but for the most part, you could tell me something about the church, I'm guessing, if you're watching this. We know our family histories. We know how we got there. We know lineages. We know ancestries. We can maybe tell you the names of grandparents and great-grandparents and on and things like that. But sometimes we forget that though we know ourselves and we know our story well, the world often doesn't, and they don't care. This king comes in, probably did not have any real reason to fear the Israelites other than there are too many of them, and what happens if I start to lose control? We don't read that this king hated Joseph. We didn't say that he hated their tradition. He just knew there's this group of people who are not like us, and they pose a threat. There would be changes. And as we start talking about the need to tell our story, I started thinking about many churches, not just First Baptist of Williamsburg, but just thinking about churches in general. And for many times we have spent so much time worrying about our history and our story that we forget that while those things are very important, and while those things have made us, and while we want to honor those who have gone before us, we have got to be aware that there are people in the world who just don't understand. And it isn't that they hate us. It isn't that they hate the church. It doesn't mean that they see us as anything other than something that might keep them from getting the life that they want. Churches in general do not have a good name in society anymore. Whether that is fair or not, sometimes because of the things that have happened in churches and continue, unfortunately, to happen in churches, there have been a lot of folks who just are done with it. They've had bad stories and they've had bad things that happen to them, and they just wonder, what is the point of being involved in any of this? But I think we can honor our history by continuing to look forward. For the Israelites, there wasn't some great catastrophe that happens. We see that Joseph passed away, and all of a sudden it just happened to be that somebody new came in who didn't understand the importance of their story and the importance of who they were. As we look at the culture around us, instead of fighting this war against culture, sometimes we need to remember that we're mad at people, assuming that they know a lot of things about us that they don't. It isn't that they know the history of faithful service that we've had in the community for the last 50 years, 100 years, and they just decided they don't like it. For the most part, what we find is with the more recent generations is that they're just disillusioned with church, and it's because they don't understand the importance of why it is that we gather. We have gathered and we perfected what it means to be believers sometimes. We're not perfect, but we perfected the systems from time to time, it seems. But there are people who look on the outside. And so I think it's just healthy to remember sometimes that the people that we assume as a threat, maybe it didn't happen because God was angry or God was frustrated. It was just a natural part of not knowing the story. With each generation, the opportunity then comes, though, to tell our story better. We have an opportunity to approach people. The generation, and I get the millennials and the generation X and Y, I get all that confused. So my understanding is the generation that I'm in, and maybe just before me, they're mad at church because they grew up in church and they had bad things happen. They saw the church make ugly stances for things. They saw churches really just do things that drove people crazy. And so you'll find a lot of folks who maybe had bad experience that have kept them from wanting to be in a church. Now, I don't believe that every experience in church is bad. Obviously, I chose to continue to serve in one. But you're going to find a generation that's disillusioned, and it's because they've had actual issues. But what I see as an opportunity for churches going forward is that you now see these younger generations who, you think this is bad, and it is in some ways, but they just don't care. They don't understand why we do, and they haven't grown up in church, and they haven't grown up in a culture that makes church the number one priority. And while we might want to rail, and I imagine there were some Egyptians who were or some Israelites who were like, oh man, when Joseph was here, I tell you how it was. And things got really bad because this new king came in, and so there was a lot of problems that were there. But we have an opportunity to reintroduce, and for the first time, introduce people to church in a way that they've never seen. We get to take the stereotypes of what people have expected to be everything that is wrong with the church and say, you know, we actually serve a God of love and of grace and mercy. And we gather as imperfect people who are called to be in the world, and we are called to be a part of seeing God's work of redeeming the world. But we have this new opportunity. As this new leader comes in, it did not go well for the Israelites, but I just thought it was healthy to remember that sometimes when things fall apart, it isn't because we can see all of the malicious intent. It is just a nature of what it means to be human. And with different generations, we have to be prepared. We see that the king goes in and really punishes them. They put them to hard work. They continue to make things harder. And yet we see through this that the Israelites continue to multiply. Their command by God was to be fruitful and to multiply. They had this role, this important role in being able to do these things. And we see that they are doing it very well. In the midst of our struggles and our frustrations and the hard times, it is helpful to remember that we just need to be faithful in doing what we can, where we can. This was a major point of Sunday's message. It'll be a major point of many of my messages, because when I'm overwhelmed by the state of the world, I have to remember that the thing that I can do most importantly is the thing that I can actually do. I can actually be a part of things. I can actually be a part of changing things, but only the things that are in my control and that are in my sphere of influence. We know where the story is going. And this Sunday, our message comes from Exodus as we talk about Moses as God part. We say Moses part of the Red Sea, as God parts the Red Sea. But be in the position of the Israelites here in Exodus 1 for just a minute. This is the beginning of hard times for their life. This is the beginning of hard work and hard labor, and there will be children who were born into this slavery and who live and die into this slavery, and they don't know anything else other than this particular life. But God will redeem. God will use one of these Israelite babies to be born and will have the life of Moses, who then has an opportunity to lead in this effort as God frees them out of their bondage. As I was thinking about the way that they were freed, we know that it'll be, in this story, you may know it'll be the parting of the Red Sea. But sometimes God saves us by sending a whale. Sometimes it's through a flood. Sometimes it's through the parting of the ocean. Sometimes it's slaying a giant. But God tends to change the world in ways we generally would not expect. And so perhaps tonight we can commiserate a bit with the Israelites and say, you know what, life can be hard. And sometimes the hardships is a result of sin, but it's not sin in the way that we generally think about. There was an apathy that made this king come in, and his desire for power continued to increase their problems. What we see is an opportunity to do what God has called us to do it faithfully, to continue living out and pointing to signs of a God who is good and loving and just, and the promises of a kingdom that never ends. And as we do that, God will send whatever it takes to redeem the world. It might be a whale or a big fish. It might be somebody to take over a giant. But hope is coming, and help is coming. So think about the stories that we tell this week. I encourage you to see what may often be pointed as a detriment as to being an opportunity. We have so many people who do not know the good news of Jesus Christ, and it's not because they're angry about it, it's just because they haven't been told and they haven't been experienced. And I think that there's a chance for revival in our community and in our country and we're all around the world, although the rest of the world's actually doing pretty good statistically, but in many parts of the world. But there's this chance for revival and for good news, and I'm really excited for that. And so the Israelites continued to get into this mess because somebody didn't understand the power of what was going on. But eventually God would be faithful, and God will continue to be faithful in our lives. I hope that you're having a great week. I say this towards the end of every message. If we've not had a chance to meet, I would love a chance to meet with you, to hear your story, to see what God is doing, to figure out how you can serve alongside of us. We have services that meet online. We have devotions like this that meet online, but some of the best ways is just to come meet. If it's on a Wednesday night with our choir practice or our children's activities, whether it's on a Sunday morning, we just would love to have a chance to get to know you and to just see what God is doing. So have a great week. Enjoy this beautiful weather. It has just been wonderful, wonderful days. And I hope we'll have some more of that, because I'm afraid that eventually the cold and darkness is going to come for a while. And so I want to enjoy what we have. Have a good week.